That's my new book, which I've spent 7 years working on whilst living in a little place called Yatesbury, about 3 miles from Avebury, and going down to Avebury virtually every day for long periods. Lots of photography and lots of field work, and which finally resulted in this book. It's probably the only pink archaeology book in history, and I hope it stays that way. So you can find mine easily in the rack. And I'm going to spend the next hour taking you on a virtual tour of Avebury, and we'll explore it. Whether you know Avebury or not, I think you'll find things in it that you're quite surprised at. For those that don't know, Avebury is about 90 miles west of London and about 20 miles north of Stonehenge. It's just off the A4, which runs between Calne and Marlborough. And here's our local map. Avebury is known as the biggest stone circle in the world, but it's actually the Avebury complex. There's a whole collection of monuments, and we're going to go and check through those. I'm torn here because I don't want to put my glasses on. I'll take the blooming things off. I hate them. I've got a screen 6 inches in front of me and I can't see it without them, so I'm afraid I have to wear glasses. Oh, what's that? This is my own contour map of the area, which is it's an area 10 miles by 10 miles with the Avebury circle at its centre. I've used it throughout my book. It actually took me a month to make this map. The Ordnance Survey used the contour lines. All the natural features of Ordnance Survey maps are copyright free, but they have copyright on the roads and towns. It's a bizarre way of doing things, but it means if you want, you can make your own contour map. And so the dark areas are the low ground, white areas are the high ground, and that lovely crinkly edge along the bottom like smoke, that's the edge of the Vale of Pewsey. So that's the lie of the land. Here are all the rivers which populate the area. Notice that on the right-hand side of the map to the east, there are lots of, that's where Fifield Down is. There are lots of where you'd expect water to be running, but they're the dry valleys that makes the chalkland so distinctive. There you can see right in the middle, that's the Avebury Henge. And these are the rivers. The River Winterbourne and the River Oscillate, which both combine to become the River Kennet, which then goes on to be the River Thames and flows into the sea. There's also to the south in the Vale of Pewsey the headwaters of the River Avon. This is the Hampshire Avon, which flows on south, and it goes past through Marden, which is now known to have an enormous henge, the biggest henge in Britain. Then it goes past Durrington Walls, which is another enormous henge, Stonehenge, and then it flows down to the sea, and the natural harbour of Christchurch must have been tremendously important in the Neolithic times, since all of these places were trading axes all over Britain. The question of why Avebury was built where it is something that I've been pondering for a long time. I think one of the reasons is that we can see Avebury's there. It's very close to a confluence of two rivers. There it is flashing. That's the Oscillate and the Winterbourne. And more importantly, it's close to a confluence of two rivers, one flowing east and the other flowing south. This is something that you find near, I think, virtually all henges, there's next to a river confluence. Not always flowing east and south, but I'd say in 3/4 of cases that's the setup. Now this may be coincidence, it may be because southern Britain has a natural tilt towards the southeast. But if you look at the sites in Scotland as well and around the country, the directions of south and east with moving water seem to be very important. And that could be because of astronomy, ironically. The sun and moon both rise in the east, they get to the highest points in the southern sky, and then they continue around and they set in the west. They then dip beneath the horizon, and so that's why in some cultures north is seen as the direction of death, and south is the direction of life. So it could be why moving water flowing east and south was particularly important. Interesting that nearly all long barrows face due east. Well, that implies to me that the people there had an interest in reincarnation, where the sun is reborn every day in the east and shined down the Barrow. This is the river confluence at Avebury. On the left there is the Oscillate, and on the right is the Winterbourne. And this is it from the other direction. It could be one of the most important places in Avebury, but most people are unaware it exists. Those rivers are actually both seasonal as well, which is an important point. They dry up in the summer, and lots of people, including archaeologists, tend to visit Avebury in the summer, when to me it's not very alive. I think Avebury comes alive when the rivers start to flow. There's another reason why the Avebury area would have been important in the Neolithic, and that's all these springs. Now these are springs, I've visited every one of these springs and found quite a lot of them as well. They tend to be hidden away in like scrubby bits of land that are not any use for farming, and so they're fenced off, and they're like liminal really, they're in between two worlds. What are springs? Well, springs are caused by aquifers, underground water reservoirs, and contrary to what many people think, they're not caverns measureless to man. People seem to think that they're like vast underground lakes in sort of Jules Verne type caverns. They're not, unfortunately. They're more like sponges. The chalkland, beneath Avebury there's about 210 metres of chalk, which is absorbent to water. So rainwater lands on the surface, it soaks down into the chalk. It can only go so far until it reaches a waterproof layer, and then it comes up again. It's a bit like if you were to put a dense sponge in a bowl, in a waterproof bowl, and put water in. Eventually the water would come up to the surface. Well, when that happens in chalkland, the water that comes to the surface erupts as a spring. They're quite dynamic springs. We know roughly where they're going to pop up, but they don't necessarily come up in the same place every year, and several factors can influence where they do come up. So the fact that because a spring is in a certain place now, it may not have been there centuries ago, or even thousands of years ago. This is the part of Avebury that I'm particularly interested in, the Greater Avebury. On the left is the Beckhampton roundabout, which those of you that are familiar with Avebury will have always turned off there to drive up to see the henge. On the right is Silbury Hill. And the most famous spring of the area is Swallowhead. It's become a bit of a shrine. People put ribbons on the trees there. And I think, really, as springs go, it's not a terribly spectacular one. I think part of the reason why it's so well known is that it's always been on the Ordnance Survey map. It's one of the few springs that is actually named on the map. William Stokely visited it in the 1720s and wrote about it. All the writers who've written about Avebury have mentioned Swallowhead Springs, but they've missed other springs that are not got such attractive names. There are the springs seen from the A4. That willow there, that's a crack willow, and there's a bunch of people there. Because it only flows in the winter, it actually looks a lot prettier in the summer, but that's when there's no water flowing. There's the crack willow. Again, dynamic, because crack willow grows to a certain size and then it cracks and falls over. Eventually it may root, but that's changing all the time as the springs themselves are changing. The stepping stones were added about 15 years ago. They're from another farm in West Overton, and they were brought in to help people cross the river. So they wanted to visit the springs. That's the actual spring head. William Stokely in 1724
described the spring head as being like a fountain that squirted out of a rock. It's obviously under pressure somehow. But the local people were digging for a fox, and it was never the same again, he says. Well, it's certainly not it's coming out like a fountain now. It's more like wet mud. It just trickles out from a hole in the bank. It then runs north towards the River Kennet, where it runs away. On the way, there are more springs. That's the main spring head, and this whole area here is full of springs, and there are more even on the other side of the Willows. It is a lovely spot, and you should really visit it. It's at its best in a wet spring. There, that's it, when it looks really magical. It's one of my favourite places. The springs that are overlooked are the Pan Springs, which I named because I found them, and the near Pan Bridge. No one knows why it's called Pan Bridge. It sounds very mysterious, but it was only built in the 1930s, so it may not be as mysterious as it appears. The Pan Springs just rise in a field and flow into a ditch and then into the river. A little further east, there's the Waden Springs. They're hidden away and completely overgrown. You wouldn't know they were there. But the Pan Springs and the Waden Springs have a lot more water coming out of them than Swallowhead. They start to flow earlier in the winter. They last for longer, and they're generally more productive springs. This is how I find springs, because there's a lot of water around in the winter in Wiltshire. It's a particularly wet county, and some of it in a particularly wet time. Some of it may be rainwater that can't soak into the ground. Some of it may be spill from the river. Some of it may be springs. So how can you tell the difference? Well, spring water in Chalkland emerges from the ground at a constant 10 degrees centigrade, which is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you go out on a cold, frosty morning, which I did for several years, then if there's a frost on the ground, then any standing water or water in animal troughs or anything will be 1 or 2 degrees, and it may even be frozen over. But put your thermometer into spring water and it'll show 10 degrees. If you put it in a stream that's fed by springs, if you're downstream of the springs, the further you are, the colder the water will be. So if there's a river and it's 8 degrees, you know there are some springs upstream somewhere. If it's 10 degrees, you know you're right on the springs. It's really simple. It's a £2.99 thermometer. It's not exactly high tech. But from this, I've managed to trace hundreds and hundreds of springs all around Avebury, and which is changing perception of Avebury itself. Because the water is at 10 degrees, the River Kennet steams on cold mornings. This is a shot taken from Bray Street in Avebury. You can see Silbury in the background. And because the ground either side of that river is at about freezing point, the water tends to steam. I use the thermometer technique to find the spring sources of the River Oscillate. The Oscillate is generally none of the archaeologists have taken any notice of it before anyway. Because I lived roughly where the L is on Oscillate, along there in Gatesbury, I lived there for over 10 years. I spent a long time looking for what I thought would be the headwaters of the Oscillate. Oops, wrong button. So this area up here, I thought there must be springs which powered the river. But no, it's just farmland and it's all drainage up there. It was a long time before I found out where the springs actually are. You may have seen the Oscillate if you've walked from Avebury to Windmill Hill. This is known as Horslip's Bridge. If you continue west from Horslip's Bridge, that's the Oscillate. It turns into a series of lovely meanders. It's a really pretty river. But of course it hardly ever exists. It's only there for a few months of the year. On a cold and frosty morning, there you can see Silbury in the background. And I discovered, can you see that channel there that's coming in from the woods? I stuck my thermometer in that and it's 10 degrees. So I realised that there are lots of springs in that woodland there.
You can see the spring water coming in. There's a huge area of springs in there, and to follow it slightly further west, there's a track called Vy's Way, which is a very old byway. That's Vy's Way, completely flooded by the water from the Oscillate Springs. What's particularly significant about the Oscillate Springs is you can see it's an area of scrubland. It's not farmed because the springs make it impractical. But that hill in the background is Windmill Hill, which was the first occupied place in the whole Avebury area. And there's always been a mystery. People were, from the archaeological evidence, Neolithic people were feasting up there. They were bringing cattle, slaughtering them on the spot, and then feasting on beef, which they boiled in big pots. Because it's a hill, there's no water supply on top of the hill, and it's never been understood how they managed to get water. Well, I think it was from the Oscillate Springs, which are just a quarter of a mile away. There are some smaller springs on the other side, but I think these are really quite major. The Oscillate Springs cover an area of about 8 acres. So if you've heard of Mead is in Amesbury, not far from Stonehenge, and it's a newly discovered Mesolithic site. Huge area of open springs where the people were killing aurochs, a now extinct giant form of cattle. And from the bones, they were feasting on them and then throwing the bones in the springs. I think the Oscillate Springs could turn out to be a similar site and just as important. So let's have a look at Windmill Hill. It's known as a causewayed enclosure. That's because it's got banks and ditches, as most earthworks do. And the standard way of making an earthwork is to dig into a ditch, take the soil and build a bank with it. If you do that in sections like a dotted line, the gaps between the ditches are causeways. That's all it means. But 3670 and 3620 BC is very tight dating. That's because of a new technique called Bayesian analysis. And it's based on probability, but it returns very, very accurate dates. So Windmill Hill, that's it seen from the A4 road. That's Vy's Way that I was talking about. Very badly named, actually, Windmill Hill, because there's no windmill, and it's not really much of a hill either. I lived in Yatesbury, and this was the view from my garden. It's surprising, actually, when you live there, how often rainbows form over Windmill Hill when seen from that western side. I think it's one of the reasons why it was regarded as a special place. It's the only hill for miles, even though it's so slight. And that's the earthworks. The 3 concentric rings of bank and ditch. The biggest one is about 340 metres across, which is coincidentally the same size as the Avebury Henge. And it seems to have been a proportion that was meaningful in some way. The dating, which I was saying is so accurate, it's now known that the inner circuit, the small circle, was built first, then the outer one. Then there was a bit of a pause, in which time the builders are thought to have gone off and made the West Kennet Long Barrow, really seriously, and then they came back and put the middle one in. The smaller dots are round barrows, which were added much later, about 1,000 years later, by Bronze Age people who had a great respect for the past and liked to put their monuments on older ones. This is the man who did all the work, Alexander Keeler, known as the Marmalade Millionaire. In the 1920s, he was the heir to the Keeler marmalade fortune. And he was very interested in archaeology, which he didn't have much experience of it. But someone told him that the Marconi radio company were planning to put a radio mast on top of Windmill Hill, which is an important archaeological site. So Keeler was persuaded to use his personal funds to buy the hill. And then he set about excavating it. He got in some archaeologists, and in the process he taught himself archaeology, developed all sorts of new techniques, and actually became one of the best archaeologists of his day. He dug out the circuits and found thousands, tens of thousands of bits of pottery, bones, all sorts of things that painted a picture of what became known as the Windmill Hill culture. It was a specific type of pottery. And so this was in the 1920s. He left the ditches open so that they could be seen, but it was realised in 1950 that they were eroding quite badly and they were in danger. So he imported some soil and he filled them in. And now you've just got these very slight recesses which are invisible pretty well until it snows. Then a light coating of snow, and you can see these rings turn up. This is the inner ring. There it is again. And when you stand back on the east side of Windmill Hill, you can see that the outer ditch goes right down the steep side of it. I just was taking that shot, just about to press the shutter, and two deer just walked in and stood perfectly in the middle of the frame for me. That's from further back, and you can see how that ditch goes all the way down the side. It must have been very visible when it was new. From the top of Windmill Hill, the views are amazing. I'd really recommend going up there. It doesn't get many visitors because you can only get there on foot. But if you look southeast from the top of Windmill Hill, you can see all of the other monuments of the Avebury complex. And most conspicuous is Silbury. There's Silbury, but coming out of Silbury there, that's the West Kennet Long Barrow. There's the stones on the end of it. You can see down the West Kennet Avenue. If you take a pair of binoculars, you can see all of this. I've just used a cheap camera on telephoto. That's looking into the Avebury Henge, which you can see again. You can also see the Adam and Eve, the long stones, which we'll talk about later. And the locals are really quite friendly. Now let's look at the West Kennet Long Barrow. It's got to be one of the most spectacular of the Avebury monuments. Again, it's Neolithic, 3670 to 3635 BC. This again was dated very accurately with Bayesian analysis. It's sited just south of the A4. There, it's lit up there. There's a parking place, and the only way to reach it is to walk along a track which takes about 15 minutes and steadily uphill. It's not too bad. There's the monument itself. It's been badly damaged in the middle in the 1800s when a tenant farmer decided he would take a shortcut through the middle of the barrow rather than going round it. He was actually expelled by the landlord for doing that, and quite rightly. This is one of my balloon shots. When I started my Avebury book project, I bought a 5-foot helium balloon and a great big tank of gas and attached a camera to it. And I think on the 3 windless days in the next 9 months, I went around Avebury and took lots of pictures. I think I'll use a kite next time because it's windy nearly all the time. But you can see the whole layout of the barrow from there. That's the front with Silbury in the background. And that's the whole barrow. It's 104 metres long, which makes it the longest long barrow in Britain. And there's the contour map, so the white area is the highest and dark areas are the lowest. And that shows the ditches along the side where the material for the mound was excavated from. On the left-hand side, that's the business end of the barrow, and that shows the stonework in plan. Built of Sarsen stone, which is the local extremely hard stone that the Avebury stones are made of. And you can see that there are 5 chambers inside. While we're still on the plan, originally these are called blocking stones. These were added after the barrow had fallen out of use. Originally it would have been kind of curved shape at the front. What's great about the West Kennet Long Barrow is that you can go inside it anytime you like. So I'm going to be talking tomorrow about some acoustic work I've done inside the barrow, and because there are visitors there all the time, I was able to do lots of work by turning up at midnight when there's obviously no one there. Let's go inside and have a look. It was restored in 1950 by Pigott, who was a very respected archaeologist. The chambers inside everything's original. It had been damaged slightly, the roof had caved in a few places, but this is the original layout. So you come in the entrance, behind that big blocking stone there, it's stone number 45 it's called. These are all the later added blocking stones. And then there's a central passage with an end chamber, known as the west chamber as well. And then either side, two smaller chambers, which you can go inside. That's the end chamber. You can see there's quite a variety of Sarsen stone. There's also dry walling, which is quite surprising. I wouldn't expect that from Neolithic people, but they used a lot of it in these type of barrows. And they used limestone that was imported from Calne, Frome, and quite a distance away. And I think at the time that must have been pretty difficult carrying stone 30 miles. I wouldn't fancy it. So that's the inside of the barrow. There's a very interesting phenomenon that happens a couple of times in a year. As I said earlier, most long barrows face east. If we start at the compass directions at north, it would be due north. We travel around clockwise, due east is 90 degrees. Well, the central axis of West Kennet Long Barrow is actually 85.5 degrees, just slightly north of due east. And as the diagram shows there, the sun rises further in the north in the summer and sets further north as well. That's why the day is longer, because the sun has further to travel. In the winter, it moves further south to 130 degrees, and we have a shorter day. There are two periods in the year, the equinoxes, when the sun is midway and it rises exactly in the east and sets exactly in the west. When we reach that time, there's a very interesting thing goes on in the barrow. Even though there's a huge blocking stone in the way, the sun manages to make its way just through a tiny crack in the side of that blocking stone and shines down the barrow. This is it in sequence. There's the sun coming up. When it first rises, it lights all the stones on the front, but it doesn't actually shine into the barrow because of the stones that are in the way. As the sun gets higher, it reaches the point where it can shine through the crack, and this dart-shaped light appears inside the central passage of the barrow. It takes half an hour for the sun to be high enough in the sky for this to happen. It shines through a crack and lights up that end stone as a tiny dot first of all, which grows. Then it continues to move in these pictures to the right. There you can see it. It gets brighter and brighter, and eventually another half hour later it moves into the northwestern chamber. It's absolutely amazing thing to see this, because actually when you're so used to the barrow being a dark, sort of gloomy place, suddenly it's so full of light that you can't actually look at it. So 1 hour after the sun's come up, it shines into that northwestern chamber. And I had to put sunglasses on actually to see that. That is so bright. It continues into the next chamber, but by that point the light's quite sort of diffused. But if you're around Avebury at the time of the winter or the spring equinoxes, highly recommended. Our next monument is Avebury itself, the Avebury Henge. There's the dates. The dating for Avebury is very, very poor. It's been known as the Carbon-14 Desert. There's virtually nothing to get any dates of. So it's assumed to have begun with the bank and ditch, 2,630 to 2,460. That's really poor as modern dating goes, but it's all we have. And there it is on Google Earth. It's a henge, so it has a bank and ditch. The material from the ditch was piled up and made into a bank, and because the bank is on the outside and the ditch is on the inside, that's what makes it a henge. It means it's not defensive. If it was for defence, then the ditch would be on the outside to stop people climbing up the bank. So a circular-ish monument with its ditches on the inside of the banks makes it a henge. That's why Stonehenge isn't a henge. See, it's really simple. Stonehenge isn't a henge because its ditches are dug the other way around. I think it's something that really needs looking at, this whole question of defining henges. Avebury is a particularly big henge. It's got 4 entrances where the roads go through, but they are actually original. It seems to have been built that way initially. It's very big. It's 1/4 mile across, about 340 metres, depending where you measure it from. And divided into 4 quadrants. So the way that Aveburyologists describe the place is by using those compass directions: northwest, northeast, southeast and southwest. Here's the earthwork itself, which is obviously 5,000 years on, has silted up. It's just material has gone into there and filled up the ditch, and the bank has eroded. This is the view of it that most people get when they first arrive at Avebury. It's the way into Avebury from the National Trust car park. Here's local kids rolling eggs at Easter down the bank. They just see it as a hill. And here they are tobogganing down it in the winter. This is you can see on the right hand side of the picture where the church is, that long black building, that's the Great Barn, which is part of the Alexander Keeler Museum. And that's actually cut into the bank when it was built in the 1800s. That's the northern entrance. And you can see it's very impressively deep. That's the northeast section. But that ditch was actually 9 metres deep when it was first dug. And it was dug with antler picks. I think it's quite amazing. This picture shows the southeast quadrant, and it's particularly unusual in that you can see the berm. When you make an earthwork, if you dig up the material from the ditch, if you were to pile it up in a bank right next to the ditch, it would just fall back straight into the ditch and fill it up again. So you have to move it a distance away, and that produces a flat area in between, which is known as a berm, B-E-R-M. And like Clouseau, there is a berm in my room. But it's quite hard to see normally. Here it is again, and that's the only part of Avebury where the berm is visible. The water table, when Avebury was being built, 2500 BC, there have been several studies and computer modelling surveys which all arrived at the conclusion that the water table was definitely higher when Avebury's monuments were being built. 2 metres higher, I think, is probably the most accurate one. But the most recent study done by 2 paleohydrologists from Oxford decided that it would have been 5 metres higher. Well, that's about the height of this ceiling from my head. I don't think that's very likely. 2 metres is a lot. So there's been, for past few centuries, it's been debated whether the ditch around Avebury was designed like a medieval castle moat. Did it hold water? Well, hydrologists use boreholes to get their data. There are none really in the Avebury area, hardly any, because it's a World Heritage Site and you can't just go drilling holes in it. But fortunately, in the Red Lion pub, which is smack in the middle of Avebury, they've got an ancient well from the 1600s, and the level it's got a glass top, and the level can be seen to go up and down. That's inside the well. So it's a lousy job, but someone has to do it. I have to regularly go to the Red Lion and test the water in the well. They actually produce a beer now called Well Water as well.
And from measuring the level in the well throughout the seasons and projecting the heights of it above sea level, it took a very long time to do. But I've now proved that when the ditches at least were first dug, 9 metres deep, they were definitely dug into the water table. It might not have been something that lasted very long. It could have even been a single event. David Field, who's a very respected archaeologist, said it may have been like trepanning, where it was like releasing something, which is an interesting idea. But you can see there at the bottom of that diagram the present 5 metre fluctuation in the red line well. There's a 5 metre variation between summer and winter. And when the level comes up in the winter, it's actually slightly above the bottom of those ditches as they would have been when they were new. If the water level was 2 metres higher, as is thought, it'd be halfway up the ditch, and the rather implausible 5 metres, it would look like a castle moat. Now you can see the berm as well on that diagram. So that's one of the things in my book which has not been known before. The Avebury Sarsens are here shown as red spots. When Alexander Keeler had done Windmill Hill, he was pretty good at archaeology by then, and he decided to turn his attention to the Avebury Circle. Well, he did the avenue first, but he decided to buy the entire thing. He was a multimillionaire even in the 1920s, when millions were rather different to what they are today. And so he just bought the whole area, and he cleared it. And the idea was to completely restore the Avebury Stone Circle. He would have succeeded if World War II hadn't started and stopped his work. As he dug down, he cleared all the mess that had been accumulated over the centuries, and he went down to the bare chalk and was quite surprised to find lots of buried Sarsens. It was well known that in the 1700s, local people had actively had competitions to see how many Avebury stones they could destroy by heating them with fire and then throwing water on to make them crack. But it was completely unknown until Keeler that most of the stones had been toppled in the medieval period and just simply buried in holes in the ground and covered over. So as soon as he cleared all the topsoil, all these stones appeared, and they could see sockets in the chalk where they fitted. So it was a simple matter of putting them back in like teeth. So let's look first at the northwest quadrant. That was the one that Keeler started on first. This is in the early 1930s. The bank's quite well preserved there, or the ditches rather. The bank is perfectly level in that quadrant. That's because Keeler made it perfectly level. And the rest of Avebury, the banks are quite wobbly. But in this one, he used dynamite to get rid of the tree stumps. Simple but effective. And he made the top of the bank perfectly level. But of course, we don't know that it was supposed to be perfectly level. It could be that all the wobbly banks are not wobbly because they're eroded. It could be because they're set to star risings or some other astronomical thing that we're not aware of. But he meant well, and it does look nice. There you see how level it is. It's quite unnaturally level. It looks like it's just been made. The ditches had been used as a rubbish dump for years, so he was very sort of modern, was Keeler. He liked equipment. So he brought an earth mover in and a bulldozer and cleared the ditch. Did an amazing job, really. Most of those stones were not standing when he arrived. This stone, I can't remember which number it is, but it's made of broken fragments that were found in a wall that was demolished. That stone that the girl's touching at the front there, that's lots of pieces as well that were stuck back together with cement. All of the Avebury stones, including the ones that were standing when Keeler arrived, are supported by cement. It doesn't look that way because there's grass grown over them, but they're all concreted in. You can see virtually the whole quadrant there. The stone on the right is called Swindon Stone. It weighs about 80 tons. And apparently it's been hit several times by trucks because it slightly protrudes into the road, which is the main road to Swindon. It's completely undamaged,
but apparently it's totaled several trucks that have hit it over the years. Good. There you can see that's the northern entrance where the road is, and that's the northwest quadrant. If we continue around sunwise into the northeast quadrant, there are hardly any buried stones there. They were all destroyed, used for building, it seems. But there are the last remains of what was known as the northern inner ring. In the foreground, there's two huge stones there. They're called the Cove. They were at the centre of an inner ring, and you can just see two stones marking the perimeter of the ring. That shows where are we? That's the Cove, and that's where the circle was. Those stones that survive are there and there. Absolutely huge, these. It's a wonderful part of Avebury. Lots of people say it's their favourite place. There would originally have been 3 stones in a kind of U-shaped setting. One of them was destroyed. Cove Stone 2, big as it is a bit like an iceberg. Below the ground, there's at least another 3 metres of stone, which is incredible. And that's been cut into the chalk as well. It weighs at least 100 tonnes. A few years ago, archaeologists, someone decided from their desk that it could be falling over, so it probably needed shoring up. So they built a special gantry to hold it, thinking it weighed about 70 tonnes. Started digging down the side, realised that it was at least 3 metres into the ground and in no danger whatsoever of falling over. And they also realised that their rig was not strong enough to hold it because it was a lot heavier than they thought. So they quickly filled it in and decided to leave it alone in the future. That northern inner ring is known as the moon circle to local pagan groups. Stokely himself described it as being lunar and feminine, possibly because of that sort of box shape at the middle of it. But Stokely was quite intuitive, and his ideas have been taken up by pagans. These are the other surviving stones of that quadrant. Moving around further, sunwise into the southeast quadrant, there are lots of buried stones in this quadrant. A local vicar, A.C. Smith, found them by prodding into the ground with an iron rod in the 1880s. But there's recently been a geophysical survey and they've shown up. Keeler started excavating this quadrant in 1939, and he started with the stones of the southern inner circle, which is this. He was unable to get round to doing all these buried stones along there, so they're still there. He was doing really well, and then the Second World War broke out, and that was the end of archaeology work. There you can see what's left of that's the restored bits of the southern inner circle. And it was built around a stone called the Obelisk, which is marked by this triangular marker. You can see the curvature of it. This is the spot that particularly male druids are very keen on doing ceremonies in. In fact, one year, notoriously, there were fist fights over who was allowed to do their ceremony in the southern circle. It's known as the masculine sun circle. And why? Because when it was there, it had a great big todger right in the middle of it, look. The biggest stone in Avebury. Let's look at it from the other side. It was felled in about 1720. William Stokely turned up and saw it laid on the ground, but it hadn't been broken into pieces at that point. It was way bigger than anything else in Avebury, 6.5 metres long. Tragic, really, that it was broken. And next to it are these tiny stones known as the Zedd Future. These were completely unknown until Keeler turned up. They were buried under the ground. They're only about 1.5 metres high. And then, if we continue further around, we're still in the Those are the inner circle. This is interesting. This is it's known by Terence Mead as the Vulva Stone. It looks perfect, but actually it was broken into lots of pieces and glued back together with cement by Keeler. And if you look at the other side of it, you can see how they used bits of metal to join the pieces together and then cover them with cement. And lots of the Avebury stones have been patched up like this. That's the southern entrance. And there are two stones there that are huge. They're just numbered 1 and 98. There they are. And the road originally ran between those two stones. So the entrance would have been slightly to the left of this picture. It was moved in the 1700s to build a toll road. There they are, the entrance stones. And one of them has a natural seat in it. It's known as the Devil's Chair. That's the Devil's Chair. So moving around clockwise again into the southwest quadrant, this was the second one to be restored by Keeler. Only one stone was standing when Keeler arrived. All the rest had been toppled and buried. You can see there, look, Silbury in the distance, how close it is. This is the stone number 9, known as the Barber Surgeon stone. It was buried, and when Keeler lifted it, he found a skeleton underneath with some medieval coins in his pocket. And because this bloke had a pair of scissors, Keeler decided that he must have been a barber surgeon. It's not true. Keeler's family apparently were barber surgeons, which is why he latched onto this idea. It's far more likely that the myth that Keeler started was that this bloke was toppling the stone, and it fell on him and he trapped him and killed him. It's more likely that he was buried just properly in a convenient place, which happened to be this stone. And also that he was a tailor rather than a barber surgeon. So from there we come into the high street in Avebury village, which has got some lovely buildings. There's a local style where they use these glazed headers to make checkerboard patterns in the brick. Very attractive. There's the hen shop and the community shop. Avebury Church is absolutely gorgeous. If it was anywhere else, it would get a lot more attention. It's a bit overshadowed, really, to say the least, by the stone circle next to it. But it's really worth visiting. It's got a fantastic rood screen made of carved wood, which had to be hidden during the Civil War in case the parliamentarians destroyed it. Lovely the way this juxtaposition of ancient and modern as well. That's the manor in the background, which, as you probably know, was restored recently by Penelope Keith and a man in pink trousers. It was a TV series on the BBC. And in the foreground is the old stables, which is now the Keeler Museum. The Red Lion. And what happened to all those missing stones then that were toppled? Well, in the 1700s, local farmers got into this competition to see who could destroy most of the stones. They'd topple a stone into a pit, light straw under it, so get it really hot, then pour cold water on and crack it into pieces to use for building stone. But it wasn't really very good building stone. It sweats and it's difficult to stick together. They were doing it for the sake of it, really. Poor old Stokely was horrified seeing it being destroyed. And the stone that they got is what Avebury is pretty well built of. Look around Avebury and there's Sarsen stone absolutely everywhere. Some of it's from destroyed monuments, some of it's from natural drifts of sarsen that just occurred naturally in the fields. But you can see all these ones that are worked, that they probably are monuments. So continuing around the Avebury landscape, connected to the southern entrance of the Avebury Henge is the West Kennet Avenue. Restored by Keeler, again. He started this before he did the Henge. This was in the early 1930s. Again, there were hardly any stones standing. There were a few visible that were toppled and yet more that were buried. Keeler did the same technique. He stripped the topsoil down to chalk, found the sockets, and there, look, you can see where the yellow dots are the concrete markers showing where the stones had been, and the red spots are the stones that have been erected. There it is from my balloon. You can see it curves around a bit like a river, and it does look quite sort of roundy in this shot. But actually, the avenue changes direction several times. It's a series of straight lines, and several archaeoastronomers have pointed out that the directions that it goes in are significant according to the moon and the sun and the stars. It's immensely complicated because all of those have changed since the avenue was built, and it's something I don't get into. The whole question of simulacra as well in Avebury. To some people, all of the stones look like faces, animals. They don't to me at all. I can't see any of it. The only one that looks like anything to me is this one that looks like a shark, which is probably something that Neolithic people in Avebury would never ever have been likely to see. There's one very clear astronomical alignment, and that's when you stand on the bank of the Henge and you look south down the avenue at winter solstice, the rising sun rises exactly in the middle of the avenue. But move your head a bit to the side and it's not exactly in the middle, but it's broadly there anyway. The avenue definitely continued further south. At the top of this map you can see the red dots, that's the restored section. Geophysics has found further stone holes further south. It disappears in the middle of there where I've put North Kennet Spring, but on the bottom of the map, on the right-hand side, there are stones, avenue stones, that can be still seen just tucked into a hedge. They're not in very good shape and they're quite difficult to see. If you want to see them, go in the winter when there's less greenery obscuring them. There was another avenue in Avebury, Beckhampton Avenue on the western side, and only two stones remain of it, known as the Long Stones, Adam and Eve. There they are, Adam in the foreground, Eve behind him. The yellow dots show how the avenue probably went. It was about the same length, about a mile or something, as the other avenue, but been very little excavation, just enough to prove that it existed. There, after my balloon shot, I've shown in where the stones originally were. On the east side of the Avebury complex is the sanctuary, a mysterious monument. Stokely saw it as it was being destroyed in 1724 by two local farmers. It's a double concentric stone circle. You can see the stone holes on the right where they've just been removed. All the stones were taken away. Eventually the position of it was lost and it was rediscovered in 1920 by Maud Cunnington. She put concrete markers in to show where everything had been. So the rectangular ones in this picture are where the stones were, but inside that smaller circle is what the real monument was initially. It was a timber circle, a whole series of concentric timber posts that may have had some astronomical significance. There it is today. You can see it's quite tiny. So when it was memorialised in stone by the later Beaker people, they put an outer ring that was twice the size of the actual original monument to make it look better. There's real geometry in the sanctuary. It looks like a jumble of posts at first, but you can see there's actually is two hexagons in the middle, then an octagon, and then you've got 12 and 16 posts. The outer one in black dots is probably just a fence to keep animals out. But there are clear axes where you can sight through it, and that's why I think it was astronomical in function. From the depth of the post holes, we can work out how high the posts were, but we don't know how they were mounted. They may have had the branches on, They may have had lintels. It's interesting that when you see it like that, without lintels, it just looks like a forest. Put lintels on and you've got a geometrical structure. There may have been upside down trees with the roots in the air for all we know. Interesting that when you see, even if you colour code the rings into different colours, it still looks like a jumble until you put those lintels on it. So when you actually know what was there, it's quite an interesting place to visit. If you don't know anything, it just looks awful. It's described as one of the least exciting archaeological sites in Britain. But this is actually quite interesting. Silbury Hill, probably the most conspicuous of the monuments, down on the A4. There it is from my balloon. It's described as Britain's pyramid. But the Egyptian pyramids are built with sides very steep, just a little over 50 degrees. And the Egyptians chose to do that, which they could, because they were making their monuments out of stone blocks. The people who built Avebury had no choice. Their monuments got sides of about 30 degrees. And that's because 30 degrees is the natural angle that loose chalk settles at. It's called the angle of repose. You can pile it up steeper, but in no time it'll end up back at 30 degrees because wind and rain will just erode it. So that's why Silbury is so shallow and why it's lasted so long, because it's at the natural angle. My friend Brian Edwards believes that the reason why it ended up like that is we can see why when we look at how white horses are dressed every year. They don't stay white. All the chalk off them moves down the hill, and it all ends up at the bottom. So every few years they do this thing called scouring, where they get fresh chalk and pile it on. Interestingly, this is the Cheryl horse, which is down the road, and it's about 30 degrees, that slope. If it was any steeper, the guys putting the chalk on it would need climbing ropes to be able to stay. So this is possibly what we may have been seen on top of Silbury for hundreds of years, as they applied layer upon layer of chalk. Inside Silbury there are about 250 layers of chalk which was excavated from the ditch that surrounds the mound. It probably looked like this when it was new. It's got this huge ditch, bigger on the western side than the eastern side, and it's powered by springs. On the Galtimore Springs there on the west, water from there runs in through a series of channels into the ditch. But what keeps it full of water throughout the winter is, as I discovered with my thermometer, there are springs all the way around that ditch. There they all are, shown on Google Earth. I found over 80 springs and marked the positions of them with GPS. I'd like to show you fountains of water squirting out of the side, but actually it's just muddy puddles like this. But you can see how much water is flowing. They gurgle and sort of sizzle. It's a fantastic sight. Get your wellies on next time it floods and have a look. It's just dried up now. So that's added to the picture of the waterworks around Silbury. Interesting that when all this water's flowing, we've got south and eastward movement. So we're back to that confluence of rivers thing that we saw in the original slide, that Neolithic people were interested in east and south flowing water. And Silbury Hill is actually built on top of springs and a confluence of east and south flowing rivers. So it must have been as special as it was possible to be. I'm almost out of time, and I've got one more monument. This is another reason why this Silbury was probably special. When it snowed, the warm water at 10 degrees from the springs melted straight through the snow. And then I realised that grass had been actively growing throughout the winter, when it should have been dormant. The bright green there is where the warm spring water has warmed the soil and the grass roots. And there are big green patches. So probably an area of permanent springtime to Neolithic people, where they could bring animals down and get early grazing at the end of winter. That green line all the way around the ditch there is where the springs are. It couldn't be more conspicuous. Now, I've come up to my time. I'm going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. I've got one. Can I give a couple of minutes here? Yeah, okay. There, that's the grass that's growing throughout the winter. There's just east of Silbury, there's one more monument which is actually invisible, and yet it's one of the most interesting monuments in Avebury. The palisaded enclosures. It was two huge enclosures made of 2,000 mature oak tree trunks, erected sunk into the ground so closely that there were virtually no gaps between them. These strange radial lines going across the landscape, completely peppered with springs. This is the area today. You can walk around it. There are footpaths and tracks. An absolutely enormous area. Vast amounts of pig bones were found. All of these posts that were erected in the ground, there were packing stones and pig bones in amongst them. There was big-scale feasting going on at some time. If I superimpose that on my balloon shots, these strange structures, the original palisades were as high as those electricity poles that you can see in the picture. Going half a mile across the landscape, no idea what those radial lines are. We only know these exist because they've shown up on aerial photographs as crop marks, and again very occasionally. The springs, one of them is particularly important. That one is right in the middle of that eastern enclosure, and it seems certain that the enclosure was built around a spring. So it's, again, hugely important that water was involved, and they were somehow commemorating water. But why? I have no idea. The water today, that spring that's in the middle, rises into a little pool and then flows off into the River Kennet and goes on to be the Thames. So it's clear when we look at the area that there are so many springs, and the springs are concentrated where the monuments are. So the springs were certainly a factor in citing the monuments. And thank you very much. There's more about all this in my book.